After over 100 years, extensive research, and even a Hollywood blockbuster about the sinking of the Titanic, most people believe they know pretty much everything about what was probably the worst event in shipping. However, nothing could be further from the truth, because there are actually countless disturbing facts about the Titanic sinking that hardly anyone really knows. That is exactly what we want to change with this video. Today, we're going to show you 10 completely crazy facts that hardly anyone knew about the sinking of the mega steamer. We show you, among other things, why the Titanic may have really sunk and by what blatant tricks some passengers have survived. We'll also talk about famous celebrities who were on board and why the Titanic could have been saved. It will be extremely amazing, so stay tuned here at Wonderlane. On number 10, we start directly with a theory that has not only kept scientists in suspense for years, but would also completely rewrite history if it turned out to be correct. Namely, the true reason for the sinking of the Titanic. For a long time, basically all experts assumed that the Titanic sank solely because it rammed a gigantic iceberg. In fact, however, after numerous investigations, some historians suspect that there was another cause that could have brought about the disaster. Namely, a mysterious fire in an engine room that probably ignited several days before the maiden voyage. Since, according to some sources, this fire occurred in the very area of the ship that later rammed the iceberg. Many scientists consider it realistic that it would have made the ship unstable and thus it was no longer strong enough to withstand the iceberg. On number 9, we continue with a fact that turns out to be particularly shocking in retrospect, and that is that most of the passengers who lost their lives in the disaster could have been saved. The reason for this is a ship called the SS Californian. The SS Californian was a British merchant ship that transported numerous cargoes around the world on behalf of the British Crown in the early 20th century. On the night of April 15, 1912, the SS Californian happened to be just 20 miles away from the sinking Titanic when it fired leeward missiles after colliding with the iceberg in an attempt to be rescued by someone. However, the captain of the SS Californian forbade his crew to sail to the sinking Titanic, thinking they were enemy war rockets. It was not until the next morning, when he received radio signals, that he realized that the Titanic had sunk and that he could probably have rescued many people. Let's continue with a shocking fact that could ensure that we will not find out anything new about the Titanic in just a few years. The reason for this lies in nature. Since the Titanic has been lying at the bottom of the sea for more than 100 years, it is mainly infested by animals and underwater plants. Although it is generally quite difficult for researchers to dive to the sunken wreck by submarine, this has always been the only way to gain new knowledge about the ship. However, this may change in 2030. Since the Titanic has been infested with a fast-growing bacterial culture for several years, it is only a matter of time, according to some researchers, until these bacteria have eaten away the entire ship and it therefore no longer exists. Therefore, especially in the next few years, some submarines will probably set off in the direction of the wreck, since it will probably no longer be there in less than 10 years. On number 7, we continue with a curious fact that shows that successful influencers have not only existed since the invention of Instagram, but that the Titanic was also a magnet for influential celebrities. After all, since it was the largest and most luxurious ship of its time, it was mainly the rich and beautiful who wanted to be the first to sail on the Titanic. For this reason, numerous actresses, writers, and, above all, entrepreneurs were on board, whose presence was intended to advertise further voyages. One of the guests scheduled at the time was one of the most important entrepreneurs of all time, which brings us directly to number 6. In fact, none other than J.P. Morgan, the founder of one of the greatest banks of all time, had a ticket for the maiden voyage. But he had to cancel his participation at short notice because he had other business appointments that were more urgent at that moment than the trip on the Titanic. For this reason, he returned his ticket a few days before the start of the voyage, which in retrospect turned out to be a rather fortunate decision. If J.P. Morgan had gone on the trip, he too might well have lost his life in the disaster, and his bank would never have become one of the biggest players in financial history. For number 5, we come to one of the most terrible mistakes probably ever made by a daily newspaper. One day after the disaster, the English Daily Mail reported that the Titanic had sunk. The newspaper also wrote that all the passengers had been rescued and that none of the relatives needed to worry. This fallacy turned out to be false shortly afterwards, but the newspaper was already in the hands of many people who had lost their loved ones in the disaster. What these people then had to experience in terms of pain and grief one day later, when the Daily Mail corrected its error, is therefore almost unimaginable. On number 4, we continue with a fact that is still a myth for many today, but is actually true. Namely, would the musicians have actually continued playing until the end? In fact, all 8 violinists who were on board to entertain the passengers kept playing shortly after the crash and the panic that quickly spread. Their hope was that this would allow them to calm the mass panic somewhat so that as many people as possible would walk in an orderly fashion to the lifeboats. While they did not manage to keep the panic at bay, They went down in history as the people who tried to make the best of this terrible situation until the bitter end. Let's continue with a fact that is extremely amazing, especially from today's perspective. Since the Titanic was presented as the largest and most pompous ship of all time, many assume that it would still hold this title today. However, if you compare the Titanic with current cruise ships, it quickly becomes clear that this is not true. If you were to place the Titanic next to a normal cruise ship today, you would quickly see that it is much smaller and could also accommodate far fewer passengers. Although the Titanic was the queen of the seas at the time, today it would not even be enough for the lower midfield. On the number 2, we come to the tragic reason for which most people really had to lose their lives in the disaster. If you think that after the sinking you could have simply held onto a piece of wood for some time above water, you are mistaken. The reason for this is the cold that prevailed on the night of April 15th. At that time, the water was just barely above freezing, so just about everyone who didn't make it onto one of the few lifeboats froze to death within 2–15 minutes. But there was one man who was able to brave the cold and who also occupies the number 1 spot in this video, and that is Charles John Guyon, who, according to his own statements, survived the icy temperature of the water thanks to a blatant trick. Guyon, who worked as a baker on board and was helping out at the bar the night of the accident, was handing out whiskey samples to passengers until the crash with the iceberg. When he knew he was about to jump into the deep end, he then drank an entire bottle of whiskey and even took some in his pockets. According to him, this saved his life, as the whiskey warmed him a little from the inside. Although it has not been proven that such a method actually works, according to Guyon, it ensured that he, as a survivor, was able to make numerous statements about the sinking of the Titanic in the future and thus provided many researchers with important data. And that's it with our video and 10 disturbing Titanic facts that are absolutely unknown to most people. Write us in the comments if you already knew these facts and what you find the most blatant. Otherwise, like this video if you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time here at Wonderlane.